So, when did businesses first start caring about their impact on people and planet? Honestly, do they even care or have they ever cared? The honest answer is yes, they've cared and earlier than you think, but for slightly different reasons than the ones companies cite today. So, I got this idea for this episode from chapter 2 of Corporate Sustainability: Managing Responsible Business in a Globalized World, this textbook. I've been reading it as part of my PhD research, and I thought this chapter was quite interesting and I want to share it with you. So, the chapter that I'm referring to is written by Moon, Murphy, and Gond and traces the historical arc of what we now call responsible business conduct, or what we call corporate sustainability. And what struck me was how much that history revealed about the contradictions that we still live with today in the business world, in society. And I'm going to take you through the three phases that they touch on in the chapter. So they touch on the industrial era, they touch on the rise of modern corporation, and the phase of internationalization. And I'm going to show you how Africa, and specifically South Africa, isn't just a recipient of these ideas. We've actually been contributing towards shaping them. So let's get into it. The 19th century was brutal for workers. We saw factories that were dangerous, there were long hours, people lived in slums, it was overcrowded and disease ridden. This was the Industrial Revolution. It was producing enormous wealth alongside enormous suffering. And yet, in the middle of that, something very interesting happened. So, a group of industrialists, many of them driven by deep industrial conviction, started doing things differently. So, let's take the Cadbury family as an example. John Cadbury founded his Birmingham Chocolate Company in 1824, and by around 1893, the family had built Burnaville. So this was a modern village where the workers for the company would have proper housing that featured a lot of green spaces and recreational facilities that they could use with their families. And the company had already set up a pension fund, or what we call a pension fund today, in around 1879, in an era when the concept really barely existed. Robert Owen ran his new landmark mills in Scotland on principles of humane management. This looked at having shorter working hours. There were schools for workers, children, and they also banned child labor for children that were under 10 years old. So anybody above 10 years old could work, which for me is still a bit crazy, if I'm being honest, but I guess it was quite progressive for those times. Okay, and then we have William Lever, who also built Port Sunlight for his factory workers in England. Here's what I find striking about this phase in particular. It was entirely driven by individual conscience. So there was no regulation, there was no ESG framework, there was no investor pressure. The accountability was entirely internal. And it really was driven by moral and religious convictions. That matters because it tells us something important. Without external structures, responsible business depends entirely on who is sitting in the chair and making decisions. Let me know what you think. Now, let's move on to the modern corporation. Fast forward to the mid 20th century, large corporations are now central to economic life. And the question of what business owes to society moves from the factory floor into the lecture halls and the policy documents. In 1953, economist named Howard Bowen published Social Responsibilities of the Businessman, widely considered the founding text of modern-day corporate social responsibility scholarship. His argument was quite simple, but also very radical. It was that large businesses have a moral obligation that goes beyond profit making. He asked a question that still drives literally the entire field today. What responsibilities to society can business people reasonably be expected to assume? Are they supposed to solve all the society's problems? And how far are they supposed to solve them? You see? But fast forward to 1970, in comes Milton Friedman, and he publishes his now infamous New York Times piece, "The Social Responsibility of Business is to Increase Its Profit." His logic was also quite clear. And he states that corporate executives are the employees of their owners. The main concern should be to increase profits, profit maximization. And Friedman further claims that spending corporate resources on social causes is like spending someone else's money without their consent. And this is some form of taxation that is carried out by private individuals rather than democratically elected governments. I want to pause here for a minute because the tension between what Bowen and Friedman bring across isn't just academic. It's the argument every corporate sustainability professional still navigates every single day. Is the sustainability in the organization a strategic investment, or is it a moral duty? Are we just greenwashing? So there's a lot to ask ourselves. And to be honest, I feel like the ghost of Friedman is still very much in the room with us. What shifts things in 1980s is stakeholder theory by Edward Freeman. His 1984 book gave businesses a new lens, where it was basically saying you're not just accountable to shareholders, you're accountable to employees, communities, suppliers, and really the wider environment. And that intellectual scaffolding is what allowed corporate sustainability to grow into something that has been a little bit more systematic. At least I would say. I'm a proponent of Friedman's work, so of course I'm going to say that. Let me know what you think. Now, by the late 1980s and around the 1990s, responsible business started to go global. At 1987 Brundtland Report, the infamous Brundtland Report, gives the world its foundational definition of sustainable development. And the 1992 Rio Earth Summit starts formalizing environmental responsibility as a corporate concern. And in 2000, Kofi Annan launches the United Nations Global Compact, which featured 10 principles that covered human rights, labor, environment, anti-corruption, and it now covers over 20,000 companies worldwide. These are important milestones, but I want to spend some time on what was happening in South Africa during the same period, because this is where the African contribution to the global story of responsible business is quite concrete, but it also is the most underappreciated. In 1994, the very same year South Africa became a democracy, the retired Supreme Court Judge Mervyn King published the first King Report on corporate governance. And it was said to be encouraged by Nelson Mandela himself, and King assembled a diverse rainbow committee that reflected the country's transformation at the time. And instead of adopting the narrow shareholder first model, which was still quite dominant in the United Kingdom and the US at the time, they went in a little bit of a different direction. And they looked at a more stakeholder inclusive model, which was rooted in the idea that companies should consider the needs and the interests of all parties. And here we were talking, considering the interests of employees, of the different communities where these businesses existed, as well as the environment, not just the shareholders. So this was not a copy of what was happening in London or New York. It was a South African answer to a South African reality, a country with extreme inequality, a workforce that had been systematically excluded, and communities that had borne the cost of extraction without sharing in any of the benefits. So the King 2 report that came out in 2002 went further, and it explicitly introduced what we call the triple bottom line into governance. Here we're looking at economic, social, and environmental performance all together. And then later in 2009 came the King 3 report, which then introduced something that would go on to honestly reshape corporate reporting globally. And that is with the integrated reporting. So the idea of integrated reporting is that financial and non-financial performance should belong in a single and coherent account of how an organization creates its value over time. South Africa's Integrated Reporting Committee was formed around 2010, and it was the first national body in the world to issue a framework for integrated reporting at a country level. And Professor King later became the chair of the International Integrated Reporting Council, taking a South African innovation onto the global stage. At the same time, South Africa was grappling with something no governance textbook had a ready-made answer for, and that was broad-based Black economic empowerment, or as we like to call it back at home, BEE. The post-apartheid government recognized that responsible business couldn't be separated from the questions of who owned the economy and who was benefiting. So BEE requires companies to actively increase Black ownership and Black management representation and supplier diversity, making transformation a structural component of what it means to be a responsible business in South Africa. So this is not just an optional extra. In telecommunications, for example, the requirement is that at least 30% of the company's African operation be Black owned. The logic is really straightforward. If a company wants to profit from a market whose people were deliberately excluded from economic participation for decades, then that company must actively contribute to reversing that exclusion. So BEE is not just about ownership. It's a guardrail against modern exploitation. It is a mechanism that says to us that you cannot simply keep extracting value from a society that is still recovering from systemic dispossession and just walk away with 100% of the benefit without including those on the ground. So let me give you a live example of why this is still important and why it matters so much. Look at the Elon Musk and Starlink situation. Musk, who was born in Pretoria and grew up in apartheid South Africa, has been pushing to operate Starlink, which is his satellite internet service in South Africa. And the BEE requirement for telecom licenses, as I've said, has historically been 30% Black ownership. And Musk has publicly called these laws openly racist, posting on X that Starlink cannot operate in South Africa because I'm not Black, he says. That framing deserves a little bit of scrutiny, or maybe a lot of scrutiny. South Africa's communications regulator has also come forth and confirmed that Starlink never actually submitted a formal license application, so it was never formally rejected. And also, more than 600 US companies currently operate in South Africa under exactly the same empowerment rules, and nobody is claiming prosecution. What happened is revealing, really. South Africa actually went out of its way to accommodate Musk because in December of 2025, just last year, they introduced what they call an equity equivalent pathway, which allows foreign companies to meet BEE requirements through development investment instead of direct ownership. But then Starlink was like sharp, and they responded by offering to connect 5,000 rural schools with free high-speed internet, which would reach about 2.4 million children. This is genuinely, or this would have been genuinely a valuable outcome. And it happened precisely because the framework held firm and demanded that the South African communities also benefit. And yet Musk continued calling the laws racist even after the deal had been structured. BEE is justified as a remedial measure, not as a system of racial superiority or permanent hierarchy. And it's meant to protect marginalized communities from the extraction logic of global capital and insists that doing business in South Africa comes with obligations to the people of South Africa. So you're probably wondering, so what does this history actually teach us? There's three things that I want you to pick up. First is that responsible business has never been inevitable. Every phase, whether it was the industrial phase or when we looked at Freeman's shareholder doctrine or even with the King reports, everything has been shaped by power struggles of who corporations are accountable or why they should be accountable. Another thing to look at is that Africa is not a bystander in the story. South Africa gave the world integrated reporting, and it gave the world a stakeholder inclusive governance model that was grounded in the context of a society rebuilding itself after apartheid. And third, the questions that South Africa was already asking back in 1994 about equity, about inclusion, and about who bears the cost of doing business are the same questions that the rest of the world are still catching up to and are still grappling with today. So yes, that is the history of responsible business. This is candid sustainability. I'm Kabelo Ratube, and if this resonated with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Stay curious and continue to keep it candid.